The knife caught the streetlight, dirty blade, then the scream. 12-year-old Marcus, 90 pounds, fresh belt marks under his hoodie, threw himself between a Hell's Angel mother and her attacker. He took the blow, felt something crack, but held his ground. 2 hours later, the Greyhound lot filled with a sound that wasn't a bus, 200 Harleys rolling in like thunder. Mama V pointed at the boy. "This one's under our protection now." Marcus wasn't a hero. He was a 12-year-old foster kid running from a home where discipline left welts. He had nothing but a handful of change and a bus ticket to nowhere. The woman he stepped in front of was Mama V, a Hell's Angels matriarch whose name carried weight in a shadow world most people never see. What happened next rewrote every rule about who protects whom. But to understand why 200 bikers mobilized for a boy they'd never met, you have to start earlier that same night. 6 hours earlier, Marcus wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for an exit. The house on Sycamore Street had 3 locks on his door from the outside. His foster father, a man named Vernon who wore a veteran's cap and a permanent scowl, had a rule: a beating for every grade below a C and a belt for disrespect, which meant anything from a glance held too long to a dinner he didn't finish fast enough. That night, Vernon had found the bus schedule under Marcus's mattress. The belt left 3 new welts before Marcus pulled his hoodie down and ran into the dark with $4.73 in his pocket. He knew the Greyhound station on 14th was the only place open late. He'd memorized the schedule. The midnight bus to St. Louis was $72. He had enough for a one-way ticket to the farthest stop that $4 could buy, a town called Oak Grove, an hour south. He didn't know anyone there. That was the point. A place where they didn't know him, didn't know Vernon, didn't know that his case file said habitual runaway, and that nobody had ever come looking. The station was a fluorescent-lit purgatory of cracked vinyl seats and a vending machine that ate his last quarter without giving him the candy bar. Marcus was on his knees fishing under the machine when he heard the heavy footsteps. A man in a stained jacket, reeking of cheap whiskey, paced the platform, muttering about that bike witch and something about money he was owed. Marcus didn't pay attention, not until the man pulled a blade from his boot and walked toward the far end of the lot where a woman in a leather cut stood alone under the broken streetlight, arms crossed, unafraid. Her patch read Mama V. She'd been a member for longer than most of the men. She was waiting for a ride that was 20 minutes late and she hadn't seen the knife yet. Marcus saw it. 90 pounds, ribs still stinging from Vernon's belt. He had every reason to stay crouched behind a row of plastic chairs and let whatever was about to happen. Nobody would blame him. He was just a kid. But then the man grabbed Mama V's shoulder and spun her around, pressing the blade to her jacket, and something in Marcus snapped. Not bravery, something older. He thought of his mother, the one they'd taken him from at age 4, the one whose face he could no longer remember but whose voice he still heard in dreams. He thought, not tonight. Not this one. He stood up, and he started walking toward the knife. The blade was 6 inches, rusted at the hilt and pressed against Mama V's leather cut just below the winged skull patch. She didn't flinch. In her decades in the club, she'd faced down worse. An ex-husband with a shotgun in '83, a gang enforcer in Oregon who broke her collarbone, a storm of bad meth and betrayal in a San Bernardino trailer park. She'd buried 2 sons and survived cancer twice. A drunk with a hunting knife wasn't going to make this 57-year-old woman beg. She was calculating her move, a palm strike to the wrist, a knee to the groin, every instinct telling her she'd have to take a cut to land the disabling blow, when a blur of stained hoodie launched itself from the darkness behind the vending machines. Marcus hit the man at waist level, a desperate tackle that surprised the attacker more than it hurt him. The knife swung wild, catching Marcus across the ribs just below his left armpit. The slice was deep but not fatal, a 3-inch gash that would need 22 stitches. Marcus didn't scream. He wrapped his arms around the man's legs and held on like a barnacle, even as the attacker beat the hilt against his back, his neck, his shoulders. One blow cracked the 8th rib, a hairline fracture that would ache for years. Still he held, and held. Until the man, suddenly aware that this scrawny child wouldn't let go, That the woman in the cut was now advancing with a tire iron she'd pulled from behind a dumpster did the math. He shoved Marcus off, spat on the pavement, and dissolved into the alley shadows. Mama V dropped the tire iron. She caught the boy before his knees hit concrete, lowering him gently, one calloused hand pressing a bandana against the bleeding wound, the other tilting his chin up. She saw his face for the first time. Young. Too young, frightened eyes but dry. He wasn't crying, not from the pain, not from the fear. He'd learned a long time ago that crying only made the hitting worse. She recognized that look. She'd worn it herself at age 9 in a foster home in Bakersfield where breakfast was a bruise and dinner was a locked closet. This boy was hers before she even knew his name. "You stupid brave kid," she said, voice cracking, the gravel in her throat fighting back tears. "What's your name?" "Marcus." "Marcus what?" "Just Marcus." She pulled him to his feet, ignoring a $60 ticket on the ground where her bus pass had fallen. The midnight bus to St. Louis hissed to a stop at the platform. Neither of them looked at it. She walked him inside, sat him in a plastic chair, and told the station attendant, a bored teenager who'd seen nothing, to call an ambulance. While they waited, Mama V pulled out her phone. Not a smartphone, an old flip-style burner that had one contact list: family. Real family. She scrolled past names like Bones, Reaper, Tank, and landed on the one listed as president. The call lasted 90 seconds. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. She said the boy was bleeding. She said the station, 14th Street, Greyhound. She said the attacker was gone but could come back. She said, "He's under my protection now. I need the road." On the other end, in a garage 60 miles north, a man known as Crow, 62, silver ponytail, a master sergeant's voice, set down a carburetor and picked up a different phone. The word went out, a group text with a single code attached, the one reserved for emergencies involving club family. Then a second. Then a dozen phone calls. Not everyone answered. It was nearly midnight, but enough did. Within 30 minutes, Harleys were rolling out of garages in 3 states. Rusty, a retired welder in western Pennsylvania, woke up his wife, kissed her forehead, and said, "A kid's in trouble." She handed him his vest. In Cleveland, a chapter sergeant major called in a favor from a brother with a flatbed truck, just in case. In Columbus, a young prospect named Digger, not yet patched, saw the text and gassed up his Sportster without hesitation, heart pounding. These weren't decisions made in boardrooms. They were reflexes, hardwired from a culture that valued loyalty above law and vengeance above forgiveness. The bond wasn't leather or engines. It was the promise that if you ever call, we come. No questions, no excuses. 197 men and 3 women, all in black leather, all with the winged death's head on their backs, began converging on a bus station in the dead of night. Back at the station, the ambulance came. Marcus refused the stretcher. He walked himself onto the bus, Mama V's jacket draped over his shoulders, the paramedics working around him. She rode in front, giving directions to a hospital she trusted, one where the staff wouldn't ask too many questions about the patch on her chest. In the ER, as a doctor stitched the gash, Mama V stood in the doorway with arms crossed, radiating a force field that told every nurse and security guard, "You will not touch this child without my permission." The triage nurse, a young woman, asked Marcus for a guardian's phone number. Marcus went rigid. He mumbled about a foster father, a house on Sycamore, his voice dropping to a monotone that made the nurse glance at Mama V with sudden, growing alarm. Mama V stepped forward. She placed one hand on the nurse's clipboard and another on Marcus's shoulder. "Ma'am, that boy isn't going back to that house tonight. Or any night. Not until somebody looks into what's been happening there." Nurse hesitated, then nodded, disappearing into the back office to make a call. Mama V didn't wait for the result. She dialed Crow again, voice low. "He's got bruises older than tonight, Crow. A lot of them. Somebody's been working this kid for years." There was a long silence. Then Crow said, "We'll handle it. ETA's 20 minutes. Keep him close." Out on 14th Street, the station attendant had locked up and gone home, but the parking lot lights still buzzed. The last scheduled bus had left. The lot was empty except for a single homeless man huddled near the trash bins. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a low rumble that grew from a distant vibration into a sustained earthquake. He stood, clutching his blanket, and watched the first headlight appear around the corner. then another, then 20, then 100. The line stretched for blocks, engines rumbling in perfect unison, the parade of bikes moving at exactly 15 miles per hour in tight formation. 197 Harleys and 3 custom choppers, the ground trembling under their weight, headlights cutting a tunnel through the gray mist. The homeless man would later tell a reporter, "I thought it was the end of the world. But then I saw the patches and I knew somebody was in trouble and the angels came." The bikes filled the lot, parking in disciplined rows like a military convoy. 200 bikers dismounted in near silence. No shouting, no revving. Just the click of kickstands and the heavy tread of boots on asphalt. They formed a human corridor between the station doors and a waiting ambulance bay, every face weather-hardened, every pair of eyes scanning for any threat. At the head of the formation stood Crow, beside him a man called Gage, the chapter's enforcer, a 300-pound wall of muscle with a tattoo of a fallen brother on his throat. The hospital doors opened. Mama V walked out with Marcus, still wearing her cut, her hand on the boy's uninjured shoulder. She led him toward the crowd, and the corridor of bikers closed behind them like a curtain. Third row back, a prospect named Digger, the youngest in the convoy, broke rank. He stepped forward and pulled off his leather jacket, his most prized possession, still clean, not yet road-scarred, and draped it over Marcus's shaking frame. The boy looked up at the big men surrounding him, at the skulls and wings and the tattoos of names and dates, and for the first time since he was 4 years old, he was not afraid. Mama V lifted her chin and addressed the assembly. Her voice carried, a storm rolling across the lot. "This boy here took a knife for me. He's got nobody, but now," she paused, letting the silence swell. "Now he's got 200 somebodies." Every head nodded. The decree was absolute. Marcus had entered a world where protection wasn't given with papers or state bureaucracies. It was given in blood and bone, sealed by the roar of engines, and it would never, ever be revoked. But by sunrise, the world outside that lot began to push back. The hospital had filed a mandatory report with Child Protective Services. At 7:15 in the morning, a county caseworker named Sheila DeWitt pulled into the parking lot where the bikes were still lined up like a metallic army. She carried a clipboard and a statutory authority that, in her mind, superseded leather and tattoos. She demanded that Marcus be turned over to state custody pending an investigation into the Sycamore Street home. Mama V, who hadn't slept, stepped in front of the boy. "Ma'am, that house gave him cracked ribs and scars older than some of my patches. You want to investigate, start there. He's not going anywhere." The caseworker threatened to call the police. Crow, the chapter president, didn't raise his voice. He simply pulled out his phone and dialed a number in Columbus, a retired judge who rode with the club in the 80s. Within 5 minutes, the caseworker's supervisor was on the line, and the standoff shifted from a parking lot to a courtroom that wouldn't open until Monday. But it wasn't the state that escalated things next. It was Vernon. The foster father, realizing the boy had vanished and that a pack of bikers was involved, made a catastrophically stupid decision. He showed up. At 10 in the morning, his rusted pickup skidded to a stop across the street from the station. He didn't get out at first. He sat there with the engine running, watching the rows of Harleys and the men in leather, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. Then he stepped out, waving a dog-eared custody document like a shield, screaming that the bikers had kidnapped his foster son and that he was calling the real cops. Gage, the 300-pound enforcer, took one step toward him. Vernon froze, dropped the paper, and scrambled back into the truck. He peeled away, but not before a prospect got his license plate. What happened over the next 72 hours redefined the entire story. Crow assigned 3 members to dig into Vernon's background. What they found was a spiral of sealed juvenile records, 2 prior foster placements that had ended abruptly, and a sister in Indiana who had filed a restraining order against him years ago, but was too terrified to testify. Meanwhile, a local reporter named Carla Jimenez had been monitoring the police scanner when the call about a gang occupying the Greyhound station came in. She arrived expecting a crime scene. She found something else entirely. A boy wrapped in a leather jacket 2 sizes too big, calmly eating a breakfast burrito while a dozen bikers stood guard. She interviewed Marcus with Mama V's permission, and what he told her in halting sentences painted a picture of abuse that stretched back years. The story hit the evening news. By the next morning it was national. And then came the twist, the moment where the narrative broke wide open. The news coverage flushed out another victim. A 17-year-old girl named Destiny, who had aged out of Vernon's home 2 years earlier, saw Marcus's face on the screen and contacted the station. She told Carla that Vernon hadn't just used belts. There was a locked basement room, threats involving a hunting knife, and a caseworker who had visited twice and never looked in the closets. That caseworker was Sheila DeWitt, the same woman who had tried to take Marcus from the bikers the morning after. Within hours, an internal affairs investigation was launched. By Friday, DeWitt was suspended. By the following Monday, she was fired. The revelation that the system had protected the abuser while trying to seize the victim from his protectors ignited a firestorm of public outrage. But there's more. While all this was unfolding, the bikers hadn't been idle. Digger, the prospect who'd given Marcus his jacket, had traced Vernon's license plate to a motel on the outskirts of town. He didn't confront him. That wasn't the assignment. He simply called it in. Crow, in turn, called the sheriff's department and told them exactly where to find a man wanted for felony child abuse. Vernon was arrested without incident, found hiding in a bathroom with a packed suitcase and $4,000 in cash. Under interrogation, he eventually confessed to everything, including the fact that he'd been taking in foster children for the state checks and using the basement as a personal prison. He would later plead guilty to 12 counts of aggravated abuse and receive a sentence of 22 years. But none of that is the biggest part. The biggest part is what the club did next, not with fists or engines, but with signatures and guarantees. While the legal system processed Vernon, the Iron Crows National Council convened an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to establish a trust for Marcus, college tuition, living expenses, a permanent guardianship arrangement with Mama V as legal custodian. And they didn't stop there. Leveraging the media attention, they partnered with a child advocacy nonprofit to create a rapid response fund for any foster child in the state facing immediate danger. A fund seeded with $100,000 from the club's own treasury, fueled by donations from biker chapters nationwide. The move silenced every critic who called them vigilantes. They weren't just protecting one boy. They were building a system where, when a child cried for help, someone would answer before angels on wheels had to appear. 6 weeks after the night at the Greyhound station, Marcus stood in a courtroom not as a runaway, but as a petitioner, formally requesting that Mama V be named his permanent guardian. The judge, aware of the media and the evidence of systemic failure, granted the request in 12 minutes. As they walked out, Marcus looked up at the woman in the cut and said something he hadn't said to anyone in 8 years. He called her Mom. And standing behind them, filling the courthouse steps, were 200 bikers who had redefined what family looked like. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a promise that no child in their orbit would ever face the dark alone again, a promise that would soon be tested in ways no one could have predicted. That test came sooner than anyone expected. 3 months after the guardianship was finalized, a 14-year-old girl named Keisha went missing from a foster home 2 counties over. Her caseworker had flagged bruises, but no action was taken. The local sheriff's office was understaffed. The clock was ticking. A club member in Mansfield heard about it from a cousin who worked the night shift at a diner where the girl used to bus tables. Within an hour, the call went up. Not a rescue mission, that wasn't their lane, but a full-scale search to find her before someone else did. 60 bikes fanned out across 3 towns. Posters were hung. Motels checked. The press, already familiar with the Iron Crows because of Marcus, covered it live. The girl was found within 18 hours, hidden in a relative's trailer, scared but unharmed. The foster parents were arrested. The club wasn't the hero of that story. They were the loudspeaker that made sure the system couldn't look away. And that became the new normal. When a child fell through the cracks, someone in leather showed up with a phone number and a promise. Meanwhile, Marcus was healing. Not just the ribs, which knit clean, but the deeper wounds. Mama V enrolled him in a small private school that accepted the club's scholarship money without blinking. He joined the wrestling team. He made a friend named Javier who didn't care about his past. On weekends, he'd turn wrenches in Crow's garage, learning to rebuild a carburetor, his small hands growing steady and strong. He rarely spoke of Vernon, but one night at dinner he asked Mama V, "Why did you believe me?" "Back at the station," she set down her fork. "Because I've seen liars, baby. You weren't one, and you stepped in front of a knife. That's not something a kid does unless he's already been bleeding a long time." He didn't cry. He nodded, and then he ate his cornbread. The ripple effects through the county were seismic. The scandal of Sheila DeWitt's negligence triggered a statewide audit of foster care placements. A hotline was established. Mandatory training was overhauled. A new policy required unannounced inspections of any home with prior complaints. The man who chaired the oversight committee, a retired social worker named Franklin Bell, later admitted at a press conference that a 12-year-old boy and 200 motorcycles changed our agency more in 3 months than a decade of internal memos. The club got a seat at the table, not as bikers, but as advocates. Mama V, with her no-nonsense drawl and her 60 years of hard living, testified before a state Senate subcommittee on foster reform. She wore her cut. She didn't apologize for it. And when a senator asked if the Hells Angels intended to stay involved permanently, she leaned into the microphone and said, "Sir, we've been a family for 50 years. We don't quit on family." The fund grew. What started as $100,000 became, within a year, $460,000, fueled by charity rides, merchandise sales, and anonymous donations from people who'd seen the news. By the second year, the Iron Crows had placed 6 more children in stable guardianships, each backed by a full financial trust and a dedicated club mentor. Marcus, now 13, attended every ceremony, standing quietly in the back in his own vest, a junior patch that read "Little Brother," and watching as other kids got the same second chance he did. But there's one detail that never made the headlines. One detail that explains why all of this really happened. The drunk with the knife at the Greyhound station. His name was Lawrence Cady. He had a rap sheet going back 15 years, petty theft, assault, 1 prior knife charge. And he had a connection to the house on Sycamore Street. He was Vernon's cousin. Vernon had called him that night, told him a foster kid had run off, told him to find the kid and teach him a lesson before the cops got involved. Lawrence mistook Mama V for someone connected to Marcus, decided to send a message. The attack wasn't random. It was a retrieval mission gone wrong. And if Marcus hadn't thrown himself in front of that blade, if he'd stayed hidden behind the vending machines like any terrified child would, Lawrence would have grabbed him, dragged him back to that basement, and no one would have ever known. The miracle of that night wasn't just the bikers arriving. It was that a beaten, broken boy chose, in the one moment it mattered most, to fight for a stranger the way no one had ever fought for him. That choice, that single impossible act of courage, bent the arc of 200 lives. It brought down a predator. It exposed a broken system. It turned a feared outlaw image into something else entirely, a symbol of protection for the unprotected. And it gave Marcus something he'd lost long before he could remember, the absolute knowledge that he was worth fighting for. The boy who'd once counted coins for a bus ticket to nowhere now had a home, a mother, and an army at his back. As for Lawrence Cady, he was arrested 3 days after the attack, thanks to the license plate the prospect had caught. He eventually pled to assault with a deadly weapon and got 12 years. At his sentencing, Marcus stood in the courtroom and read a victim impact statement in a steady voice. He said, "You tried to break me, but all you did was lead me to my family." Behind him, the courtroom gallery was a sea of leather. No one cheered, they just nodded, because that's what family does. And Marcus, after 8 years of silence, had finally found his voice. The story of Marcus, Mama V, and 200 bikers is not about leather or engines. It's about sight. About what we see when we look at someone and what we refuse to see. The drunk with the knife, the caseworker with the clipboard, the neighbors who called the cops on 4 wet men knocking at their doors. They all looked at the surface and made their choice. Hattie looked at Diesel's eyes. Booker looked at Dalton's shaking hands. Mama V looked at a 12-year-old kid with belt marks and a cracked rib and saw her own reflection. They saw humans where others saw threats, and that difference saved lives. Here's the question I keep coming back to. If you'd been at that Greyhound station that night and you saw a scrawny boy throw himself in front of a blade, and then watched a woman in a leather cut make a phone call that brought an army, what would you have seen? A gang or a family? Would you have crossed the street or stepped closer? I'm not asking what makes you look good. I'm asking the honest answer, the one that sits in your gut when no one's watching. Because somewhere tonight, there's a kid like Marcus counting coins for a ticket away from a nightmare. There's a Diesel behind a door nobody will open. And there's a Hattie waiting to say, bring them in. The only question is whether we'll be the seventh door or the one that pulls the curtains shut. If this story moved you, drop a heart in the comments. Hit subscribe so the next story finds you. And share this with somebody who's forgotten that quiet courage still exists. Because someone, somewhere, is still knocking. Be the one who answers.